68-year-old Margaret sat quietly in the airport security line, and no one knew that she still carried shrapnel fragments from an IED blast in Afghanistan 40 years ago in her leg. When the metal detector went off, the security officer impatiently shouted, "Remove your shoes." Margaret's response was calm, but determined. "This is going to take some time. Welcome to Human Stories." Before we begin this powerful story, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help this channel grow. We share meaningful stories like this every week. Boston Logan Airport's Terminal C was at its usual morning rush at 7:30 a.m. Business travelers were buried in their phones, families were trying to calm their children, and elderly passengers waited patiently in line. Long queues had formed at the security checkpoints, everyone anxiously checking their watches, worried about missing their flights. At security checkpoint number 12, Margaret Thompson waited quietly, clutching her bag tightly. Her gray hair was neatly arranged in a bun, and a small American flag pin sparkled on the collar of her blue blouse. While her slight limp was noticeable as she walked, her posture remained straight and proud. No one realized she wasn't just an ordinary retired woman. When the man in front of her passed through the metal detector, followed by a young woman, it was Margaret's turn. Security officer Mark Williams glanced impatiently at his watch. The shift change was approaching, and the line was still long. 28-year-old Mark had been doing this job for 2 years, and his impatience grew with each passing day. "Come on, ma'am, remove your metal items, take off your shoes, and step through," Mark said, keeping his hand positioned beside the metal detector. Margaret placed her metal items in the small tray, her bracelet, watch, and cell phone. Then she slowly began removing her shoes. She took off her left shoe, then moved to her right shoe, but this took a bit longer. "Ma'am, could you speed it up a bit? There are people waiting behind you," Mark said, not bothering to hide the impatience in his voice. "This is going to take some time," Margaret replied in a calm voice. Mark rolled his eyes. How long could it possibly take to remove one shoe? After Margaret removed her right shoe, she slightly lifted the cuff of her pants. At that moment, everyone near the metal detector saw it. Margaret's right leg below the knee was missing. In its place was a modern prosthetic leg. Mark froze in place. The other security officers behind him, Susan and James, had also noticed the situation. The passengers in line were now looking at Margaret, not with impatience, but with curiosity. "I apologize," Mark mumbled, the harshness in his voice instantly disappearing. "It's all right, son," Margaret said. "Everyone thinks they're in a hurry. I used to be that way too." Margaret began removing her prosthetic leg. This process took several minutes, because it was an older model prosthetic that required a special method for removal. The entire security checkpoint had fallen silent. People were no longer looking at their phones, and even the children had quieted down. After removing the prosthetic, Margaret passed through the metal detector. As expected, no alarm sound, but when she handed her prosthetic to the X-ray machine, technician David Miller frowned as he watched the screen. "There are metal pieces in this prosthetic," David said, "but these aren't normal prosthetic materials. What is this?" Margaret sat in the wheelchair and waited to get her prosthetic back. "A souvenir from Afghanistan," she said calmly. David looked more closely at the screen. Inside the prosthetic, he could see metal fragments, shrapnel pieces, and even a small bullet fragment. "Ma'am, these fragments from an IED that exploded in my leg 40 years ago," Margaret said. "The doctors said they couldn't remove them. When they made the prosthetic, they left them inside, both as a memento, and so I wouldn't forget that day." Susan, James, and Mark had now gathered around Margaret. Other passengers also approached to listen. The noise in the terminal decreased, as if everyone wanted to hear this quiet woman's story. "Were you in Afghanistan?" Susan asked, her voice mixing respect with curiosity. "I was a nurse," Margaret said. "I worked at the base hospital outside Kabul." James was a former soldier, a Vietnam veteran who immediately understood the seriousness in Margaret's story. Being a nurse there in those years couldn't have been easy. Margaret nodded as she put her prosthetic back on. "It wasn't easy, but someone had to take care of those wounded kids. American soldiers, Afghan civilians, sometimes even enemy soldiers. We treated everyone who was wounded." Mark had now become a completely different person. His impatience had given way to respect. How did you lose your leg, ma'am? Margaret finished putting on her prosthetic and stood up from the wheelchair. As she began putting on her shoes, she spoke. It was summer night. I was escorting an ambulance, returning from the hospital to a village. We hit an IED on the road. Driver Tommy Jackson died instantly. I lost my leg, but I survived. The crowd gathering around them was growing. People were no longer thinking about whether they'd missed their flights. They were listening to this quiet hero's story. A child tugged at his mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, is this lady a hero?" Margaret heard this and turned to the child. "No, sweetheart. I was just someone doing her job. The real heroes are my friends who stayed there." David asked, as he returned the prosthetic, "Those metal pieces, why didn't you ever have them removed?" Margaret felt the metal pieces inside the prosthetic as she responded. "The doctors said the risk was too high, but the real reason, they're part of my friends. Pieces from Tommy's ambulance, from the exploded IED. From that, if I removed them, I'd be forgetting that day and my friends who died there." The silence grew heavier. Margaret finished putting on her shoes and picked up her bag. "May I go now? My grandson is waiting for me." Mark immediately stepped aside. "Of course, ma'am, and I'm truly sorry." "Thank you for your service." "You serve too, son," Margaret said, in a different way. "But you serve. Don't forget that." As Margaret prepared to pass through, James stood up. He too was a Vietnam veteran and knew what he needed to do. He saluted. Then Susan saluted. Then Mark. Then Dave. One by one, all the security officers at the checkpoint saluted Margaret. But it didn't stop there. The surrounding passengers had understood the situation. An elderly man stood up and began applauding. A woman waved with tears in her eyes. Children also applauded Margaret alongside their parent. Margaret smiled emotionally, bowed her head slightly, and walked slowly through, leaving behind a respectful silence. But the story didn't end there. Margaret's grandson Mike was waiting for her at the gate. 25-year-old Mike knew very little about his grandmother's past. Margaret never spoke about her war experiences. "Grandma, you're a bit late. Was there a problem?" "A small security check," Margaret said. "Nothing important." Mike noticed how the other passengers behind his grandmother were looking at her. Respectful, admiring. "Grandma, why are people looking at you like that?" Margaret took Mike's arm. "Sometimes, when people learn about our past, they act differently. But I'm still the same, Margaret." On the plane, as Margaret sat in her window seat, flight attendant Jennifer came over to her. "Excuse me, ma'am. My friend at security called me. Is there anything special we can offer you?" "I don't need anything, dear. Thank you." "Those pieces, are they really still in your leg?" Margaret slightly lifted the cuff of her pant. On the prosthetic, the locations of the pieces that didn't show up in the metal detector but were visible on X-ray were apparent as small bumps. "Friends who have been with me for 40 years, she said. "Pieces from Tommy Jackson's ambulance, shrapnel from the IED. Thanks to them, I don't forget that day." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "You're a real hero." "No, dear," Margaret said, looking out at the clouds through the window. "I was just someone who was where I needed to be. The real heroes are Tommy and my other friend. They didn't get to come home." As the plane departed from the airport, Terminal C's security checkpoint was visible below. Mark, Susan, James, and David were still working there, but they were now different people. Margaret's story had changed them. Mark now showed more patience with elderly passengers. Susan approached passengers in wheelchairs more carefully. James showed special respect to uniformed soldiers, and David wondered with each alarm that went off in the metal detector, "Does this person have a story too?" A week later, airport management hung a small sign at the security checkpoint. "Every passenger has a story. Approach with respect and patience." Margaret's story became a legend at the airport. It began being told to new security officers during training. Margaret, known as the prosthetic leg nurse lady, had become a symbol of unseen heroism. Margaret continued with her life. Every time she traveled, she calmly passed through security control, removed her prosthetic, and patiently told the story of those metal pieces to anyone who asked. Because Margaret spoke for forgotten heroes, for Tommy Jackson, for all her friends who stayed in Afghanistan, and for all other veterans living secretly in civilian life. Those metal pieces weren't just shrapnel. They were memory, respect, and the symbol of sacrifice that should never be forgotten. Mike began spending more time with his grandmother after that day. He listened to Margaret's stories, looked at her photographs, and learned how she was a quiet hero. "Grandma," he said one day, "why did you stay silent for so long?" Why didn't you tell anyone this story? Margaret set down her teacup. Because Mike, real heroism isn't done for show, it's done quietly, and only spoken about when necessary. But shouldn't people know? The only thing people need to know is this: silent heroes live around us. Your elderly neighbor, the grocery cashier, the bus driver, they all have a story, and they all deserve respect. The X-ray image of Margaret's prosthetic from that day was framed in the security unit of Boston Logan Airport. Under it was written, "Margaret Thompson, never forget, always show respect." And every day, thousands of passengers passing through that security checkpoint unknowingly experience Margaret's legacy: a more patient, more respectful, more understanding security control. Because sometimes, the power of a seemingly ordinary moment can change entire lives. The metal pieces in Margaret's leg are still there. Pieces from Tommy Jackson's ambulance, shrapnel from the IED in Afghanistan. But now they're not just painful memories. They're symbols of hope, respect, and unforgotten sacrifice. During every plane journey, when Margaret passes through the metal detector, those pieces ache slightly. But that pain reminds her of Tommy, her other friends, and the value of those days. And when the people around her learn how extraordinary this seemingly ordinary elderly woman actually is, they begin to notice silent heroes in their own lives. This is how Margaret's story isn't just a moment experienced at an airport. It's a lesson for all of us to learn to see the hidden heroes around us. Have you ever looked more carefully at the people around you? Your elderly neighbor, the grocery cashier, the bus driver. Maybe they too have stories waiting to be told. Like Margaret. Share with us in the comments. Have you ever discovered someone's extraordinary past when you least expected it? Which city are you watching from today? And if you believe that the stories of silent heroes like Margaret deserve to be told, subscribe and support this channel's growth. Because at Human Stories, we share meaningful stories like this every week. Remember, real heroes are everywhere. Sometimes you just need to look carefully.